December 1944. The snow lay heavy across the Ardennes forest, a white silence broken only by the slow creak of boots and the metallic clatter of rifles. Inside a captured American outpost, a group of German officers stood among overturned crates and abandoned gear. The air was bitterly cold, and yet the scent that drifted through the bunker was almost comforting. Coffee. An American coffee pot, dented but still warm, sat upon a small field stove. Steam curled upward, the dark aroma defying the frost and smoke that clung to every wall. One officer, his gloves stiff with frost, lifted the cup and stared at it as though it were some strange luxury. Around him, the floor was littered with boxes, each marked US Army Field Ration Type C. Inside, tins of meat, fruit, chocolate, cigarettes and powdered coffee. For a moment, no one spoke. The front was collapsing, the Reich was bleeding, and yet here, in this small outpost, the officers found something deeply unsettling. Evidence not of American firepower, but of American comfort. Because what they saw inside those boxes told them more about the United States than any captured weapon could. It told them why their enemy fought so long, so far from home, and why in the end the German soldiers' iron discipline could never match the quiet strength born of a warm cup of coffee in a frozen trench. That small object, the steaming coffee cup, would come to symbolize a truth that every captured officer later admitted. The Americans didn't just fight differently, they lived differently, and that difference was changing the war itself. The German army entered the Second World War with confidence, a machine of precision, discipline, and order. Its victories across Poland, France, and the Balkans came fast, built on the myth of blitzkrieg efficiency. Every detail seemed calculated: fuel, ammunition, men, movement. But beneath that mechanical rhythm lay a fragile truth. Germany had built an army stronger than its stomach. By 1941, as Operation Barbarossa roared eastward into the endless Soviet plains, that fragility began to show. Supply columns stretched hundreds of kilometers behind advancing divisions. Horses pulled half the Wehrmacht's wagons, and food, the most basic element of morale, began to run short. German soldiers marched on black bread, watery soup, and the hard iron ration, Eisener portion, a small packet of preserved meat, biscuits, and coffee substitute. It was designed for survival, not spirit. Most of it was cold, monotonous, and scarce. In harsh winter conditions, men thawed tins over candles, scraping frozen fat with bayonets. Some joked grimly that they'd eaten better in peacetime prisons. Across the Atlantic, America was preparing for war in a very different way. The United States, untouched by invasion, had time and resources to feed not just an army, but an idea. American war planners believed that morale was a weapon. A well-fed soldier, they argued, fought longer, thought clearer, and believed more deeply in what he defended. Factories in Chicago, New Jersey, and San Francisco began producing something the world had never seen before: industrialized comfort. Canned ham, beans, coffee, and fruit cocktail rolled off assembly lines by the millions. Army quartermasters spoke of logistics as morale. To them, feeding the spirit was as vital as feeding the stomach. By 1943, every American GI carried a small metal box stamped US. His ration, a microcosm of the country he came from. Inside was sugar, chocolate, gum, cigarettes, and always coffee. That coffee, rich and aromatic, became a ritual. On muddy mornings in France, on frozen hills in Italy, men gathered around tin cups like monks around a sacred fire. It wasn't just warmth. It was America itself distilled into a drink. The taste of home, of diners, of Sunday mornings before the storm. German intelligence noticed. Reports intercepted from field officers described American camps as astonishingly well provisioned. One observer wrote, "Their rations contain more meat in one day than ours in 3. Another noted with disbelief that US troops receive chocolate and cigarettes regularly, as though they are not in war at all. For a Reich built on discipline and scarcity, this was a shock. Germany had entered the war under blockade, its economy starved of imports and food diverted to civilians under strict rationing. Soldiers fought on calories calculated for efficiency, not satisfaction. Even officers found themselves stretching supplies, bartering for bread or sausage with locals. But the Americans, they seemed to bring a piece of home wherever they went. A hot meal in the rain, a can of peaches in a foxhole. It wasn't luxury. It was a declaration. Each tin, each cup of coffee carried a message. We are not just surviving, we are living. And that, German officers would later admit, was a kind of strength they had never trained for. The contrast grew sharper as the war dragged on. When Germany's rations thinned to grey bread and ersatz coffee, roasted acorns and barley pretending to be beans, American supply ships crossed oceans filled with real food, real flavour, real abundance. By 1944, as captured supplies were examined and compared, German analysts realised what they were truly up against. Not just an enemy with more tanks and planes, but a nation capable of mass-producing morale. The first time this realisation was recorded formally came from a small intelligence division within the German Army High Command. They had been ordered to study captured American rations for nutritional content, but what they found went far beyond calories or protein. Their reports, quietly circulated among officers, described something almost psychological. American rations are designed for pleasure as much as for sustenance. It was, they wrote, a new philosophy of warfare. The coffee cup, still warm in those captured bunkers, became the ultimate symbol of that philosophy. It told the story of two very different armies, one enduring, one believing, and that difference was beginning to change the face of war. By the middle of the war, the contrast between the American and German supply chains had become a living symbol of two worlds. One was an industrial democracy whose strength lay in mass production and human comfort. The other, a disciplined autocracy that demanded endurance above all. Germany's logistics system had been designed for short, sharp wars, campaigns that would end before shortages began. But by 1943, as the Eastern Front consumed millions of men and machines, the system was collapsing under its own weight. The German soldier, or Lanzer, became a master of improvisation, bartering with locals, trapping animals, or stretching rations into thin soups. The official ration, 3,400 calories on paper, often fell to half that in practice. Winter made everything worse. Frozen bread had to be hacked apart with bayonets. Meat spoiled when transport broke down. Ersatz products, synthetic coffee, artificial fat and bread stretched with sawdust or potato flour replaced the real thing. Soldiers joked grimly about Ersatzkrieg, the substitute war, but the Americans were fighting a very different kind of battle behind their front lines. Their supply networks stretched like veins from the factories of Detroit and Chicago to the beaches of Normandy and the islands of the Pacific. Cargo ships and Liberty transports carried the weight of an entire civilization. Not only bullets and bombs, but chocolate bars, canned fruit, powdered milk and cigarettes. To the Germans who captured those supplies, it was both astonishing and humiliating. In one report from 1944, a German officer wrote, "We fight with discipline and spirit. The Americans fight with abundance. Their soldier eats better than our officers. Even in retreat, they leave behind wealth unimaginable in our own ranks." This abundance wasn't just about comfort, it was psychological warfare. American commanders understood that morale was measurable. A soldier who looked forward to a hot drink or a sweet treat would endure more, fight harder, and recover faster. It was logistics with a human heart. Each US division had entire sections dedicated to feeding its men. Field kitchens followed units into battle. Portable stoves, tin cups, and ration heaters became as vital as rifles. The Quartermaster Corps tested every meal for calories, variety, and taste. They rotated menus to avoid monotony. They even included small luxuries, a piece of candy, a pack of cigarettes, a packet of salt, to remind soldiers of home. For a German observer, this seemed absurd. In the Reich's military culture, comfort was weakness. Deprivation was a virtue. The ideal soldier was stoic, uncomplaining, devoted to the fatherland above his body. But by 1944, even the most loyal officers began to question whether endurance alone could sustain victory. When captured, American rations were brought to analysis centres in France and Poland. The reaction bordered on disbelief. They contained not only high-quality food but thoughtful details, disposable can openers, waterproof packaging, even chewing gum to freshen the mouth after a meal. It wasn't merely food, it was morale wrapped in tin. One analyst noted that the American soldier carries his homeland in his pack. To a German officer trained in austerity, that was an alien concept, and a dangerous one, because the man who feels cared for, they realised, fights for something greater than orders. He fights for the life he hopes to return to. Even the coffee, that simple steaming comfort, had become strategic. It kept men alert on night watch, warmed them in foxholes, and gave them a moment of humanity amid chaos. Soldiers swapped coffee packets like currency. It became part of American identity on the front. By contrast, the German soldier drank bitter substitutes, roasted barley or acorns, barely warm, often foul-tasting. The difference wasn't lost on anyone. American warmth wasn't just physical, it was ideological. It said, every man matters. The longer the war dragged on, the clearer it became. The United States had turned supply into strategy. While German logistics shrank under bombing and scarcity, American supply chains expanded like arteries feeding a living giant. The same factories producing tanks were also producing the comforts of home. Every soldier from North Africa to the Pacific was linked to that invisible lifeline. To German officers analysing captured rations, it was like peering into another civilization, one where industry and humanity worked together, where even the smallest item reflected national confidence. Their conclusion was recorded quietly in military archives. The enemy's strength lies not only in his machines but in his spirit, nourished daily by abundance. That spirit would soon become the invisible weapon that the Axis could neither match nor destroy. From this foundation, the story shifts from logistics to psychology, how German officers began to admit that morale itself had become the decisive front line of the war. By the late summer of 1944, as the Allied armies surged across France and the Reich's defensive lines began to crumble, the German High Command turned increasingly to study its enemy. They wanted to know how the Americans kept advancing despite exhaustion, long supply lines and endless combat. The findings came not from generals but from field officers, pragmatic men who observed the front up close. In August 1944, a report titled Beurteilung der amerikanischen Soldaten, Assessment of the American Soldier, began circulating among Wehrmacht staff. It concluded with a line that struck many like a confession. He fights with a calm confidence born of material and of belief. His rations alone would be enough to sustain morale for months. Captured rations were laid out on tables in French warehouses and German laboratories. Tin cans gleamed under harsh lights. Inside, investigators catalogued everything: ham and eggs, beans with tomato sauce, fruit bars, chocolate, cigarettes, even packets of salt and sugar. The precision amazed them. Every calorie counted, every meal balanced, every item designed for endurance and comfort. But it was the coffee that lingered in their minds. One officer wrote privately, "They drink real coffee, hot and black. It smells of home. I think it must remind them of their women, of peace. Perhaps that is why they do not break." Such notes rarely reached the propaganda ministries. They contradicted the myth of the spoiled, weak-willed American. Yet among officers who had fought in Italy and Normandy, there was grudging admiration, even envy. A German captain named Karl-Heinz Schaefer, captured during the retreat from Normandy, later recalled in interrogation, "We found their camps, everything neat, efficient, and comfortable. We were astonished. Every man had food, cigarettes, warm clothes, even a small packet of chewing gum. We could not imagine such a thing in our army. We were proud soldiers, but we were tired and hungry. They were never hungry." That word, hungry, appeared again and again in post-war testimonies. Hunger became the measure of morale. Hunger made men doubt. It made orders harder to follow and courage harder to sustain. By contrast, abundance built confidence. American soldiers joked, sang, shared coffee, and talked about home. The simple ritual of gathering around a boiling pot gave meaning to their fatigue. It turned a foreign battlefield into a fragment of America. One US sergeant in the Ardennes later said, "We never forgot who we were, even when it was hell out there." You could smell coffee and feel like the world still made sense. German officers who observed this began to realize that food had become ideology. The US Army's logistics weren't just about efficiency. They were a mirror of democracy itself. Every soldier, regardless of rank, received the same rations, a concept unthinkable in the hierarchies of the Reich. Equality in food reflected equality in purpose. To the German mind, forged in class and order, this was radical. Their officers dined separately, often far better than the men who fought for them. The American system erased that divide. A general and a private might drink the same coffee, eat from the same tin. One Wehrmacht colonel summarized the difference with brutal honesty. "They have made every man feel important. We have made every man feel replaceable, That sentence would haunt him long after the war. By early 1945, even as Berlin lay in ruins, German researchers compiled their final studies of Allied logistics. They noted that morale among American troops remained surprisingly high despite heavy losses. The secret, they concluded, was not propaganda, it was daily life. Food, comfort and routine preserved sanity. The same report ended with a final observation, written in stark prose. An army that feeds the soul as well as the body cannot be easily broken. It was the first time in modern military history that morale had been quantified through rations, that the contents of a tin box could represent an empire's philosophy. The German officers who studied those rations weren't simply learning about food. They were witnessing the anatomy of a democratic army, one that fought not only with discipline, but with faith in its own way of life. Every can of meat, every chocolate bar, every steaming cup of coffee became a quiet act of ideology. And for the men who analysed them, that realisation was both humbling and terrifying. Because deep down they understood. It wasn't only the factories that Germany could not match. It was the spirit that filled those tin cups and sustained the men who drank from them. That spirit had a taste. It tasted like coffee. Now we move into the psychological and symbolic layer of the story, where the coffee cup becomes more than just a soldier's comfort. It becomes an emblem of what America represented on the battlefield: warmth, equality, and belief in life beyond war. In the final winter of the war, when the front lines blurred and men lived half frozen in foxholes, the difference between armies could be seen not only in their weapons, but in their smallest rituals. For the American soldier, that ritual was coffee. It began before dawn. The snow still black under a faint sky, a few men would strike matches under steel helmets turned upside down, using ration tins as makeshift pots. The smell of burning fuel mixed with the scent of instant coffee, sharp, bitter, unmistakably alive. Men gathered around those cups like moths to a fragile flame. They spoke little. They didn't need to. The act itself, heating water, sharing warmth, was communication. It meant survival. It meant normalcy. It meant home. For the Germans watching from across the lines, that image left an impression that no bullet or tank could erase. Through binoculars, they saw soldiers who laughed, who rested, who drank something real. Even in chaos, they looked content. To a nation where scarcity had become patriotic, the sight was unnerving. In the Reich, food had long been propaganda. Posters urged civilians to eat less, waste nothing, sacrifice always. Even the phrase, "Der Sieg ernährt sich nicht von Butter," victory is not fed on butter, became a moral command. Comfort was seen as weakness, indulgence as betrayal. But here, in the enemy's campfires, was a contradiction. The Americans were comfortable, and yet they kept winning. The coffee cup, in its quiet defiance, symbolized something deeper than calories or warmth. It represented a different kind of power, the ability to care for the individual even in collective struggle. Captured German officers spoke of it with a mix of disbelief and fascination. One Luftwaffe major, interrogated after surrender, recalled, "They would brew coffee in the mud. Always coffee, even when shells fell. They were not fighting for conquest. They were fighting to return to that cup." The symbolism was impossible to ignore. For the Americans, coffee meant connection, to home, to hope, to democracy. For the Germans, it revealed the emptiness of their own ideology, a system that demanded loyalty but offered little comfort in return. In that small cup lay the difference between fear and faith. When German analysts studied captured rations, they noted the consistent inclusion of luxury items: sugar, chocolate, gum. To them, it seemed absurd that an army would waste shipping space on such things. Yet, as they examined morale reports, they began to understand. Those small luxuries were investments in endurance. A man who tasted sweetness in war could still believe that sweetness existed in the world. It was psychological armour, as strong in its way as the steel that covered tanks or ships. By contrast, German soldiers wrote in letters home of hunger and fatigue. "We are tired of cold bread," one wrote in late 1944. "We no longer feel human." That loss of humanity, that erosion of simple comfort, ate away at the will to fight far more efficiently than any Allied offensive. The Americans, by feeding the senses, had fed the spirit. When the war ended, and the studies were completed, several German officers privately admitted what they could not say in uniform. They had underestimated not only the American machine, but the American heart. One, whose name was redacted in post-war archives, summarized it best. "We were trained to obey. They were trained to live." That statement captured what historians would later call the morale gap. It wasn't measured in supplies or strategy, but in the unseen strength that came from believing life was worth defending. The coffee cup, dented, stained, ordinary, became the perfect metaphor for that strength. Even decades later, veterans remembered it vividly. Some German officers who emigrated after the war spoke of the first time they saw an American camp, its men drinking coffee while artillery thundered in the distance. "They seemed to live inside another world," one said, one where war had not killed their humanity. That was the essence of morale. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of meaning. And in that sense, the battle between rations was more than a study in logistics. It was a glimpse into two civilizations at war, one defined by scarcity and obedience, the other by abundance and belief. As historians would later write, the American ration was not just a meal. It was a manifesto written in tin and steam, in chocolate, sugar, and coffee. A promise that democracy, even in its most brutal hour, could still taste like home. When the guns finally fell silent and Europe lay in ruin, both victors and vanquished began to study not just how the war was fought, but why some soldiers endured while others simply collapsed under its weight. The American ration, so ordinary in form, became one of those quiet symbols historians kept returning to. It wasn't just food, it was philosophy packed in cardboard and tin. Inside those small boxes were fragments of an entire worldview, the belief that even amid destruction, life deserved warmth, taste, and care. Every sugar cube, every stick of gum, every small can of meat whispered the same quiet message: "You matter, even here." For the German soldier, this message was unimaginable. His training taught him duty, not dignity. He fought for hierarchy, for a cause that devoured comfort and replaced it with command. He was told that emotion was weakness, and that obedience was virtue. But as the war dragged on, it became clear which system truly sustained the human spirit. In every ruined village, every captured trench, the Americans carried with them not only rifles and tanks, but something less visible. A moral abundance that no ration shortage could starve. They believed that survival was not enough. One had to live even in war. That was democracy's quiet victory. Freedom was not only a political word shouted from podiums, it was there, steaming in tin cups in the dead of winter, shared among men who refused to let brutality define them. It was there in the laughter between shell bursts, in letters home scented faintly with coffee and tobacco, in the act of caring for the smallest comforts in the darkest hour. Historians later said that while Germany built its war on discipline, America built hers on morale, and morale, as every veteran came to know, could not be issued by command. It had to be nourished, one meal, one moment of comfort at a time. As one American sergeant wrote in his diary outside Bastogne, "The coffee kept us human." And that, I think, is why we won those words, scribbled in the cold, carried a truth larger than any strategy map or victory parade. Wars are not won only by machines nor by numbers. They are won by men who remember what they are fighting for. And so, long after the last shot was fired, that small cup of coffee, steaming in the frozen dawn of a Belgian forest, came to represent more than just nourishment. It became a monument to a civilization that believed in the sanctity of life itself, a symbol of a nation that fought not to conquer, but to preserve, and in doing so proved that even amid fire and fear, the human spirit could remain warm. Because in the end, what the German officers discovered when they studied American rations was not simply a lesson in logistics, it was a lesson in humanity. And that, more than any weapon, any plan, or any speech, was the true strength of the United States in the Second World War.